Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this month's episode of Don't Get Rusty here at AOPA. And as you can see by the title screen, today we're talking about how to de-terrify stalls. And the subtitle, of course, being how to get confident and comfortable with less lift. Also notice the new artwork on the screen here too. So thanks to Stephen for doing that. So it's kind of cool. I dig the colors. And let's get moving. All right, what we're gonna do really quick is just go over the controls like we always do, just to make sure that if anybody's new on the show, that they'll know how to handle it. So we have our attendee control panel. If you are using a computer, you want to look at this side over here. And what you will see is that you have a little question bubble there, like a cartoon bubble with a question mark in it. And you'll click on that, then go down and type in your question in the box where it says ask the staff a question or something like that. And just make sure that you hit the send button, because if you don't hit send, we don't see it. Over here, we've got the attendee control panel. If you're using a tablet, something like an iPad or whatever else. And in this case, you're looking for that little question mark symbol. Again, it'll pop up a little window, type in your question, hit the send button, and that will make sure you hit the send button so that we see it. And a little side note too, we do have an admin panel here with GoToWebinar, and it does show us to the second, split second if it were, the reply, every reply in order. So it may look a little different than what you see there on the audience side. Okay. My name, as always, is Chris Moser. Really glad to be here with you. I work here at AOPA, helping out CFIs and flight schools, including our AOPA Flight Training Advantage app, AFTA we call that one, and our Flight Training Experience Survey and Awards. Actually, I need to update that because we're just going to call that the awards from now on. And today we are joined by our great guest, Donnie McKay. Donnie, you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, Donnie McKay. I'm the senior manager of the Rusty Pilots program. So don't get rusty, but if you do, I am here for you. I am a private pilot, husband, father of two. I just put on here two of my favorite flights, or actually three of my favorite flights. The New York City corridor, I've done that once. I've got plans to do it a couple more times. That's a whole lot of fun if you've never done it. And then flying the kids back and forth to college, Virginia Tech, University of Tennessee. That's been a blast. Yeah, anyway, so run the Rusty Pilots program, helping lapsed pilots get back in the air, whether it's your flight review has just expired or you've been out for 30 years or more, we can help. And then Back to Your Roots is a relatively new initiative. It's to help professional pilots and retired professional pilots get back into general aviation flying. So that's it. And then there's Stephen. Say hello, Stephen.
Hello, Stephen.
There you go.
Here we go, Stephen.
Yeah. So I'm coordinator, Flight Training Initiative. I work with Chris Moser directly, and also work on the AFTA program, the Flight Training Awards, and a variety of other projects, including producing our webinar series on a monthly basis. Made the decision to actually go ahead and run another marathon. I was kind of batting that back and forth. I think in addition to my achievements, I need to do another marathon, make sure I can prove that it was not a fluke. I can do it more than once. So we'll see if that training is going to happen in the next couple of months. See how that goes.
Good Lord, yeah, oh my goodness, yes, running a marathon. That's crazy, yeah. Stephen. And by the way, I was remiss about saying too, Donnie, when you were on, if this is a perfect opportunity, we often get people that are confused between the Don't Get Rusty show that we're running here and your program, Rusty Pilots. They are different, not the same thing. And so we've often debated, like, should we change the name of the show just to try to avoid confusion? But we had just have a heck of a time trying to figure out what else we would call it. So anyway, thanks you guys all for being here. And also I know lurking in the background, sort of hidden, is also Chris Horwat is with us today. He'll be helping moderate questions as well. All right. Want to make sure that everybody understands that all of Don't Get Rusty and our You Can Fly programs are funded by generous donations from the AOPA Foundation. So if you would like to help do that, or just in general help get and keep people flying, that could fund any of our You Can Fly programs, including the high schools program, flying clubs, and the flight training initiative as well, the AOPAfoundation.org, and scholarships too. I forgot about those. So go visit AOPAfoundation.org. We would love to have your assistance on that. Now, a couple of reminders. I know Dan normally does this, and hopefully he'll be back next month with us. But if you are viewing today on this live broadcast only, you will get Wings credit as long as you registered using the email address that you use with your FAAsafety.gov address. So as long as you're on the live broadcast, if you're watching this at a later date on one of the recorded sessions, then unfortunately you are not eligible for wings credit for that. But just make sure you've given us your FAAsafety.gov. If you register with it today, you're good to go. There is nothing that you will need to do. It will be automatically done. Just give us a couple of days for Stephen to get the list and then gets it over to the appropriate person. In fact, a lot of times that's Donnie, and then we'll get it off to the FAA. If for some reason you don't think you register with it, then let Stephen know there in, I guess, the chat, and let him know what your email address would be. All right. The other question we often get too is this being recorded? Why, yes, it is being recorded. And in fact, if you just give us a few days, probably by the early next week, maybe even Monday, you'll see it up on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and look for AOPA pilot video. And then within that pilot video channel, there is a playlist called Don't Get Rusty Webinars. That's where you'll find it. So you can check it out there. And then the other place you can also look once it gets posted as well is on webinars.aopa.org, and you'll look down below and see that Don't Get Rusty label right there. So those are being recorded, and obviously if you're watching this recorded, you've already found it. All right, Stephen, you want to tell us a little bit about this day in aviation history?
Oh yes, May 16th, 1929, our first Academy Awards. The movie Wings was put out by Paramount Pictures. Won, I believe it was Best Film? Looking through the
Best
details
Picture,
on
yeah,
that.
Best
Best
Film, that's probably
Picture,
what it is.
yeah. And it was a silent film, and the only silent film to win Best Picture. But it kind of became a standard for aviation films from that point forward, and is still celebrated today.
So I guess it didn't get anything for audio on that part.
No, they did the whole like synchronized music. There's no dialogue and sound effects, but
All right, very cool. Well, it was an epic of the air, so maybe go check that one out. I'm sure it's available somewhere online. All right, what are we doing today? Well, today we are going to talk about stalls, obviously, and deterrifying stalls. So we're going to talk a little bit about what are stalls, just in general. We're not going to get into, I'm assuming you guys already know the basics, so we'll just talk a little bit more in detail about stalls. We'll talk about when they can happen. The key part here is I'm going to talk about best practices in not only doing training in stalls, but also to help you prepare to deal with them if they were to happen inadvertently. How to stay coordinated, I'm going to talk a bit about that, the types of stalls, how to avoid them, and then finally at the very end, tips for deterrifying stalls. So hopefully, if some of the folks out there are worried about them, you'll be able to help out with this. And in fact, let's go ahead and roll this poll and get an idea of where people are with stalls. So the question is, how often do you practice stalls? Is it A, you only do it if you're flying with a CFI? B, I just do it on my own, but regularly. I'm pretty comfortable with them. I'll do it on my own while practicing. C, only during my flight review. It's the only time I want to do them, obviously with the CFI, and that's just do it the bare minimum. D, never. You kidding me? And then E, every time I fly because I am slow flight. So go, let us know what you think. What do you think, Donnie, if you're on there? What would you think the audience is going to say for this one?
I'd probably say only during my flight review.
Okay, so I think that's going to be the average. That'll be interesting. My guess would be probably just with a CFI, although that could be complied with the CFI one too. So it depends. Let's see what happens here.
Yeah, that's probably it. But I think a lot of people probably only fly with their CFI during their flight review.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, because it's I know for me, for a long time, I was terrified of doing them. I never wanted to do them unless I had a CFI with me. Yep, because it seems scary to me. All right, we've got about 76%. Let's just get it to the 80% mark, and then we will look at the results of our poll. Definitely seeing this is a little more even. Sometimes we have a kind of a blowaway winner, but this one's definitely a little competition there. And somebody, Steven, are you the one that put in the every time I fly because I am slow flight?
No idea what you're talking about.
Look, I'm wondering if somebody real did it. Okay, looks like we got 79%. Let's go ahead and just close the, there it is, 80%. Let's close the poll and see what you got. All right. So it looks like if you can see the results there, we got 38% only with the CFI. So kind of expectation. On my own regularly at 33%. So that's maybe a little more surprising as our second place one. Some folks out there are not so bad at them, or are not so concerned about doing them or worried about them. And then 24% doing the flight review. 2% said never, 2% every time I fly. I appreciate you guys picking my dumb answers because I think they're funny and hopefully you do too. Okay. Well, let's, for those folks that are like only doing with a CFI or maybe only doing their flight review, maybe we can give you some tips here to help make it not so scary. So the first of all, are stalls scary? Well, check this out. Is this what you think of when you think of stalls? Here we go. Jack the nose up. Oh no, there goes the wing, and down there goes the nose too. So I made these using just a flight sim on a computer real quick. So it was a little bit jerky, but I'll do that one more time. So this is what I remember them being like when I was doing my private, and just not liking that at all. Here we go. Now we're dropping out of the sky, and why am I doing this? So the question then is, do they have to be? And I'm going to use this video a couple of times, but I want you to check this one out. I'm going to demonstrate here a power off stall. And I can remember during my private taking the yoke and just having to like crank it up to get it to break. And it wasn't until later that I was taught by some really good CFIs that you don't need to do that. In fact, in reality, when are you probably really going to do that? That's not how a stall is going to surprise you. So check this video out. Here, what I do is I pull the power. I then just hold altitude. I pick an altitude and I decide, okay, now I'm just going to hold altitude. Notice the nose does not come above the horizon. And I get a little descent going here. And I think around 3,100 feet, I think is where I decide, okay, now I'm just going to hold altitude. Maybe around 3, holding it, holding it, holding it. Notice the descent's happening. You can see, and there it goes. And notice that the nose drops. That was the stall. I add power back in and recover. So notice the fact that we don't have huge, drops. We don't have the nose going way up in the air, which can be scary and probably not realistic. And we also don't have that push forward as well. So check that out. I'm going to show this video again, and I'll talk more about something else too, about where to look when you are practicing stalls to help you with your coordination. So hopefully that was a little less scary for those that do worry about them. But that's the biggest thing for me is like, can we do it in a way that's not so crazy? All right, any questions so far, Donnie, before I move on here?
So Chris, we got two good comments from the poll. Well, we got more than that, but two that I want to bring up. One said, I don't think I am slow flight applies because you can stall at any speed. And I know you're going to talk about that in a bit.
Yes,
so that's a great one. And then another one, it made me laugh. It said I stall with every landing.
Hey, that's pretty good. You can bring it right in at the edge of that, just right as you touch down. Nice. Okay. So what is a stall? And I am going to talk about several things. And I know we had a couple of audience questions that came in earlier too. People emailed in that I will also discuss. So number one, what is a stall? Now, this is one of the audience questions that I mentioned, and I'm remiss about because I didn't write down the person's name in my, not on here at least, so I don't recall. But the person did ask me, this watcher or watcher, this audience member did ask me, what's this deal when the wing stalls? Does the whole wing stall at once? And no, it does not. I know that we often see these photos or these diagrams, and you can see here's the nice smooth airflow. We have this, the moderate angle of attack here, which we obviously need to create lift. If you want to learn more about that, go back to that episode we did on lift back in December. And then as you increase angle of attack, the airflow starts to separate near the trailing edge. And as this happens, now we're not producing that lift anymore on that section of the wing. And then typically what we see is this one, you hit critical angle of attack and it's all burbly, and it makes it look like the entire wing is no longer producing lift, but that is not true. In reality, the wing is still producing some lift, and you can even see it. This is right out of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge on page 5, or chapter 5, page 25, that in a stall, the wing does not totally stop producing lift. Rather, it cannot generate adequate lift to sustain level flight. The way I say that oftentimes is, I'll just say that the wing is not producing enough lift to maintain level flight. So it's just not enough. So when that stall happens, there's still some lift being created, just not enough to help us, to let us maintain altitude. So you do still have some lift being created by the wing. Now, when do stalls happen? Do they only happen at a given airspeed, VSO, VS1, depending on your configuration, only in slow flight? Well, of course, obviously, as that smart audience member already pointed out, no, that is not true. It can happen at any airspeed and at any pitch attitude. And in fact, does it only happen when we're at a high pitch attitude, as like, in other words, the nose way up to above the horizon? Nope, not at all. And in fact, here's a picture right here. And by the way, all these pictures are pretty much all of them. I have links in the handout for you that go to these various things. This is from an AOPA article. And what this one's talking about is that we do have the inertial path here. This person's in this dive, and as they're diving, they then pull really hard and really like they have to create all this lift to overcome the G-forces, or as they're being created as they're trying to pull out. And you can stall in this nose down attitude. And what I wanted to show you was, and I'm hoping this is going to work. We were testing it beforehand, and it looks like it did. But let's find out really quick. Check out this video. And I know you won't hear the audio, but you can see the thing here. But just going to show you what happens when we go down. And so Dave Hirschman, one of our editors here, is going to take an airplane, in an aerobatic airplane, and point the nose basically straight at the ground and demonstrate a stall. So you're going to see that. So here it comes, right here. Check this out. And I'm hoping you can see the captions that are below. So he goes into a loop.
No, he's in Mike's Epsilon.
Yes, there's a cool
Nice.
airplane he's flying there. Here it comes. So now the nose is straight down, and now look at that. He goes into the stall right there with the nose down. He pulls back, goes critical angle of attack, and you can see it right there, even wanting to start to rotate like in a spin. And one thing he notices here too is that there's the thing we're going to talk about a little bit later, which is that startle response, which is you're pointed down at the ground. What is your instinct? You want to pull back to get the nose up, but in doing that, you can end up stalling the airplane because you're pulling it beyond critical angle of attack. So it can happen in any pitch attitude and at any airspeed. And we'll talk about that, which is called an accelerated stall, a little bit later. Okay. Any questions before I move on, Donnie?
We got one that was really good here is that in the video that you showed a few minutes ago with the two stalls, it said, would that second stall example be sufficient for a check ride? Which is a good point. They're not all like incredibly dramatic. Some of them are really, really like soft. I mean, they're not, some of them aren't real scary.
Right. And in fact, to answer your question, absolutely. That was an example. I was just recording a power off stall, and that's the ones that I like to introduce to people when they're new in training. That's the first stall I introduce. Actually, I do it in a simulator first just to get them through the procedures, then go in the airplane and do that, because they often hear this whole idea. They're scared of it, the stall in the airplane idea. And I show them that. And in fact, I had a reaction from one student one time. They were like, literally like, oh, that's it. I'm like, yes, that's it. Not a big deal. So that is an example of a well done power off stall. That's the way you should be doing them, because that's probably what's going to happen to you when you do it like you're trying to stretch a glide or something else. We'll talk more about that in a little bit for how you do that power off stall. But yeah, totally fine for a check ride.
The other comment was one of my instructors told me to use 75% power for power on stall. And that's a good point, because when I first started learning, it was full power. And I mean, you were pulling back and you were aiming at the sky. And
Yes.
when I got back into flying, that was one of the first things I noticed when we were doing stalls, was that it's not full power anymore. It's less power. You don't need all that power. You don't need to pull all the way back and get, nose all the way up into the sky. You can do a good power on stall with less power and not quite as high an angle of attack.
And that's going to depend on the airplane that you're flying as well. And I believe the ACS, and I'd have to go double check this, but I think it's 65% is what they say. Okay. You want to do. Now that is in there because of the fact that somebody might be training in something like a 182, which has got much more high power, and that nose is going to end up way up in the air on a power on stall. So you don't want to do that because it's also not certified for spins. However, you do need to make sure in your training that your CFI is prepping you. If you're flying something that's the typical training aircraft, like a 172 or a Piper, like an Archer or whatever, that don't have really powerful engines, make sure that you are proficient at doing them at full power as well, because the DPE, the examiner, very well may ask you to do one at full power to full brake. That is possible. But yeah, what I like to do is introduce them at that less power just to start with, get used to it, get proficient, and then you can ramp up to the full power ones once you get it. So we'll talk more about tips on those in a little bit. All right, does the whole wing stall all at once? I talked a little bit about this before, and the answer is typically no. Most general aviation wings have what's called washout. Now, this diagram is from the new Naval Aviators. It's like the Aero Training Guide. There's a link in the handout. It's replaced the old Naval Aviators Guide to Aerodynamics. I was trying to find a good diagram. This is the only one I could find that was kind of the government source. And So on this washout thing, what it's kind of showing you is that with most general aviation aircraft are going to have this kind of twist thing. And what you'll notice is that the root is at a different angle of the way it's attached to the airplane than the wing tip. And so for any given relative wind, the root is going to end up being at a higher angle of attack than the wingtip, and that is on purpose, because that way when the stall begins to happen, it's going to happen at the root first. You'll get the buffet, you might even get the nose down and the brake, but it allows your wingtips to still have some good airflow, and that way you'll have some aileron authority to potentially help, although you have to be careful, and we'll talk about the aileron thing just momentarily. So wing stalls at the root first, allowing some aileron effectiveness to remain. And in a case, what this one's saying too is that also you can have what's called aerodynamic twist, which you'll notice just the shape of the wing is different as well. So it could either be the geometric twist where the actual wing is kind of twisted or warped along the way that it is, or this aerodynamic twist, which is literally just the shape of the camber or curvature of the wing that could have the same type of effect. All right, questions before I go, Donnie?
Chris, just back to the power on stalls. So we had a comment that this person's instructor told him to use 75%, but the DPE made him use full power.
Yes.
And then the second comment was that I was taught to use full power because you're simulating the stall on the takeoff.
Yes.
Which you can still do without full power, though.
Yes, that's why I was saying it. So it depends on the airplane you're in. Really, that rule or that exception or whatever it is put in there for people flying really high performance aircraft. So like, for example, if like I can remember flying, I used to fly Piper Chieftain when I was flying freight, and that was turbocharged. And so we didn't climb out at full power in that. We would use partial power just to keep it within limits of the engine. So that's there because it's one for safety, and it also might be so you don't overspeed the engine. So that's why, like I said, I like the idea of starting out at 65% in power and then getting proficient and then slowly ramping your way up to full power just to sort of ease you into it so it's not quite so scary. But you do need to be proficient in the typical training aircraft at full power with a full brake, just in case that's what the examiner wants to see. All right, so best practices in training stalls. And I'm going to try to use this as my theme as I talk about the stalls that we go through today, and we will talk in detail about power on stalls, power off stalls, accelerated, elevator trim. We're going to talk about each of those and just what they are, and if I'm one or two others that I'm not remembering off the top of my head here. But number one, when you're doing these stalls, make the scenarios realistic. So like that video that I showed, you know, it's not realistic that when you're stretching a glide that you're going to yank the nose way up in the air. And I remember doing that as a student pilot, and that's kind of what I was taught, and that's not realistic. So try to make the scenarios realistic, you know, because typically you're not going to put yourselves in pitch attitudes like this in a general aviation aircraft. It's not what you're going to do. So try to like think, when would this happen and how can we simulate that so that I will know, like, sort of learn that part of, well, the next step, which is I want to be able to learn the recognition that I'm in a situation that it could be happening, that it is happening. I'm starting to feel and know what that's like. And then also, just as importantly, how to recover from it. So really what you want to learn is not even so much as like, how do I make the thing stall, but how do I recognize, how do I avoid, and if it were to happen, how do I recover safely from it? That's what your real goal is in all this. It's not so I can perform stalls, it's more about that recognition and recovery part. Also work on minimum loss of altitude, because when is it most critical that we deal with these stalls? It's when we're at low altitude. And so you always want to work on that. How do I minimize loss of altitude? And I'll talk about that as we go through each of these as well. And then finally, train at that startle response, just like Dave Hirschman was showing in that video. And by the way, that video is linked on the handout, so you can go check it out later and listen to it. You know, when that nose is pointed down at the ground, the pilot's reaction is going to want to be pull back. But in reality, when you stalled nose down like that, you actually need to reduce back pressure, right? You've got to like let the airplane speed up and gradually pull it out of that dive. So we want to train out those startle responses, our natural instincts. And we do that by understanding what's going on and then practicing these at safe altitudes so that we will have the proper reaction if it were to happen inadvertently down low, especially. Okay, so best practices in training stalls, a little bit more. The proper application of the controls. One of the key parts here, and by the way, this picture is from, there's two times that I've used this, is from Rod Machado's How to Fly an Airplane Handbook. I love his photos. You know I love his stuff. But his book, I put a link on the handout to this as well in case you want to go check it out. I have an older version, 2014. I know he's got more updated stuff now, but he goes, I love the pictures that he does here, and I just couldn't find them anywhere else on our AOPA materials. But the big part here is this proper application of controls. We're always taught from our flight instructors, if the wing starts to drop, do not put in aileron to fix it. You're supposed to put in, of course, rudder. So use rudder to correct for that. So keep the wings level using rudder, not with aileron. And here's the reason. When you're approaching stall and you put that aileron down, the aileron, so let's say in this case that the wing is starting to drop to the left, you're starting to do that roll to the left, and you put that aileron down, you are increasing the amount of lift being created by that wing. Well, if we're increasing lift, you can just sort of do the backwards logic of it. You've increased the angle of attack. So if this airplane is already getting to critical angle of attack or is starting to stall, and you put aileron in, you've just made it worse. You've just increased the angle of attack even more and put it into a deeper stall if it's in that point of stalling, or if it's just on the edge, maybe you're going to get it to stall by putting that aileron in. So that is why it is so important that we use rudder instead to counteract that roll tendency. So really, really important. So be careful. And that's why your flight instructor, I'm sure, is all over your case about do not use ailerons on this recovery. Now, you will find, like I talked about, you have that washout thing, and sometimes you can use a little tiny bit of aileron, but if you just do that startle response, roll it all the way, you're going to see that wing drop even harder. So I will use a little tiny bit as I'm working my rudder, lots of rudder. These are my rudder pedals here. This is what this is supposed to be, but I will be using that, and then I might use a little bit of aileron just to help me fine tune, but you do not want to go full left or full right with that aileron. It will make that wing drop even harder. All right, questions before I move on, Donnie?
So yeah, Chris, I've got one about a loop, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this or not, but in a loop, how will you know if it's reaching critical angle of attack?
Okay.
Is that something you can speak to?
Yeah, kind of. I can give you my best educated guess. I'm not like a trained aerobatic pilot that I'm not going to say that I'm experienced at flying loops. I've done one before, but that's, like I said, I'm sure it was incredibly ugly, and I was with somebody that knew what they were doing. But anyway, the big thing is it's more about energy and knowing your energy and your kind of the airspeed, and of course you've got altitude and the energy, so they will know when they do loops and things like that. They'll know the entry speed so that as they do it, they know they've got enough energy to make it over without stalling. It's probably not unusual for an aerobatic airplane. And in fact, now we're even moving into GA airplanes starting to have angle of attack indicators that would help as well. So I know in the old, like the old fashioned ways of like flying like in a decathlon or something, the older aerobatic aircraft is more about they just know airspeed and they know the feel of the airplane and what's going on. And then of course with more modern stuff, getting an angle of attack indicator would make it even more precise. So hopefully that answers the question for that one. But it's probably, I would guess that those old aerobatic pilots is probably by feel and just knowing what entry airspeed they should.
All right, and then this one was a comment that they wanted to know if they understood this right. It said, I've heard that an airplane can stall at any airspeed, but only one critical angle of attack. Do I have that right?
That is correct, absolutely correct. And in fact, I'm going to show you a little bit later. I don't think I jumped ahead where I wanted to do it. No, I have not. When we get to accelerated stalls, I'm going to show you something out of our Essential Aerodynamics, a little demo too, with an accelerated stall to show you can do it at any speed, but it always happens at the same critical angle of attack for that wing.
Okay, and one last comment. Where do I find the language for using the power setting for doing stalls in a 182?
That's a good question. I have to go back and look at the POH. So, and I guess what they're asking about is using reduced power, and that's going to be more of a judgment call there. I know in the 182 that we fly around here, that nose is so way up in the air. We don't even go to full brake in it. It's like we'll kind of go just to we'll get horn and then just recover, and we typically don't use full power because you feel like you're standing it on its tail. So it's just more of a judgment thing. If thing's got a powerful engine, no reason to be trying to go to full brake, and especially because if you screw up and it spins, it is not certified for spins. So there's no reason to get kind of into that risk area. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Now, let me talk. This is one of my favorite things that I've ever learned, and I showed in this video, and the only reason I didn't show this in a power on stall was that the simulator I was using was not really behaving as well. And a lot of times simulators don't. This is an older version of X-Plane that would run on my work AOPA laptop. And so it was not behaving really well when I got to those more extreme pitch attitudes. It wouldn't spin properly and everything else. So that's the only reason, like I said, I didn't show a power on stall. But what I'm about to talk about will work for power on stalls as well as for power off. And I love this tip for power on stalls. How do you maintain coordination when it comes to when you're practicing stalls? And I'm even going to talk a little bit about in general too, some other little tips for that. So obviously you can do quick glances inside at the inclinometer. You'll see it right down here, right on our turn coordinator, that little ball, right? If it's in between the two lines, you know you're good, right? And of course we step on the ball to keep it coordinated. We just add, if the ball's to the right, we add some right rudder, bring it back over to the center. And if we keep that thing in between those lines, we're good to go. But I know I always had a hard time trying to like pay attention to what I was doing, and then those quick glances, you can practice it that way. But I had a CFI that taught me this trick, and it changed my world when it came to doing stalls and being able to do them proficiently. And that is, use something like a reference. Like I like to use clouds if they're available, just like in this video that I set up, or I can also use the ground over here on the side. And like I said, this works really well for power on stalls, even when that nose is at a higher pitch attitude. So check this out. I'm going to play the same video again, but I want you to notice that what I'm going to do is that if the nose starts to move to the left, I'm just going to apply a little bit of right rudder. If the nose starts to move to the right, I'm going to put a little left rudder. I'm going to use the rudder to keep the nose from moving. And if I do that, the ball will stay centered. And so that's a way of maintaining coordination that I don't even need to look inside the airplane to know. I just know if I keep that nose still while I'm doing it, I'm going to be in good shape. So check it out, Riho. Pay attention to that. So here I go. I'm flying in cruise. I think at this point I start to pull back power and start to just let it slow down. And then I decide, okay, now I'm going to put it into a nice little glide. And then at about 3,100 feet or so, I level off. You can see the airspeed indicator getting nice and low there. And now as I'm pulling it, waiting for the stall, I'm just using the rudder, and you can kind of see me applying it there and keeping the nose still. And if you notice, and I'll do it again here, let me just back it up just a second here. Notice that as I do that, jump it ahead a little bit. Whoops, oh shoot, sorry about that. There we go, let's try that again. You'll notice that as I'm doing that with the rudder, the ball, I'm adjusting it and keeping the ball, and I'm not even looking at it. So I can tell you that while I was making this video, I was just looking outside, the thing's starting to juggle, and you see that I'm just applying that, and that ball stays coordinated the whole time. And there's my recovery. I had power, and notice I only lost about 100 feet or so. And that was that idea that I talked about too, is work on how do I do minimum loss of altitude. And I'll talk about little tips for those. And then I just went into a bank here. Okay, so that's my one big tip that I would really like to share with you. This can work in turns too. It's a little harder when doing a turning stall. You have to watch for that relative motion as the airplane's also turning. Excuse me, but you can use it for that. So that's the idea of the cloud and ground. You can do that. Rod, in his book, in that How to Fly an Airplane book's got some good tips as well. He says you can use the relative motion of the aircraft even during turns. So you should be seeing, kind of like watching, and I'm not gonna be able to describe it as well as he does, but even in turns when you're not even trying to stall, but just doing turns, you can watch that relative motion and seeing the ground coming at the nose of the airplane in a straight path. If you see it sliding across either way, then you know you're not coordinated. So you should kind of see the ground coming at it in a kind of that straight line or in line with the airplane turning. And that's how you can look outside. However, he does warn, this does not work, especially lower to the ground, if there's a big wind, because then you're drifting. The wind can be causing you to drift, and it will not keep it coordinated. And then the other thing you can do too, and this is probably one of the ones that I think is the more challenging ones to develop, is that idea of flying by the seat of your pants, or using the kinesthetics of feeling if are you getting pushed left or right in your seat? Are you feeling like one side of your rear end kind of getting pushed harder than the other, and you can adjust for it that way. And that takes definitely some practice to start to learn that and really paying attention. So hopefully that helps. I want you guys go try out my idea of this moving thing, especially in straight stalls. Man, it made it so much easier once I learned that, once somebody taught me that one. All right, any questions before I move on, Donnie?
Yeah, that's great advice. I'm going to try that because I hadn't heard that before. Just a couple of comments from previous questions. And apparently in loops, I've never done them, but apparently in the loops, you can still feel the buffet and the controls get mushy just like they do for other stalls. So that's pretty cool to hear. Let's see, there's a comment about a specific airplane, but I've heard this about other airplanes as well, that some of the POHs say they actually recommend not to do stalls. And this gentleman said he used to fly a Mooney 20J, and the POH stated not recommended, and the owner of the airplane told him, don't ever stall the airplane because you'll get into a spin and you won't be able to get out.
Okay.
And this person wants to know, is there truth to this? And I've heard this about other airplanes.
Yeah, I honestly, I would have to defer to checking out, like, there's the Mooney owner group, so there's the various type groups, like the Mooney owner group, the Bonanza owner group. I would check out their materials. I have no doubt that they've got training materials on that, so I can't speak effectively to that, but I know, like, I will know in general that in some airplanes, yeah, you don't take them the full break. I kind of seem to remember doing that, like when I was flying the Chieftain. I think in the training I did there, and even the Piper Lance, I remember the company didn't necessarily want us doing that. We would just do it to sort of horn, maybe buffet, and then just recover. We didn't go to full break, again, because we didn't want to spin them, and there was liability there. So that would not surprise me if that was the case. Maybe that some aircraft are not. So, but check your POH and check with those owner groups. Check with those folks that are experts in those types of aircraft. For me, I've got lots of time in a 172 in training, so they're a very docile and tame aircraft.
Okay, so this one, maybe backing up a little bit, but at what point are you concerned about a spin?
Let me get to that, because I'll talk about that.
Okay.
That's basically getting uncoordinated. So that ball gets out and you're doing a stall. You add stall and yaw, Y-A-W. That's when you're going to end up potentially getting to a spin, and that wing, if that wing drops, then off you go. So we're not going to get into a lot of detail about spins today, but that's a topic for a future episode, and I would love to get a good guest on with us that is like a super expert in spins. I've done them, and I know how to teach them, but I don't claim to be an expert in those. But I do know that the biggest thing you want to do to avoid is don't get uncoordinated. If you don't get uncoordinated, you will not spin. So, okay.
Okay.
Let's go
Thanks.
ahead. I know we've got a few more here to cover. I just want to watch our time. Do you have something else, Donnie, or no? Okay. All right. So just general stall recovery steps. These came out of the Airplane Flying Handbook, so I thought I would just very quickly go through these. These are not necessarily everything that you might do in your airplane, because you might not be equipped. But the Airplane Flying Handbook, which I put a link to in chapter 5, I believe it was, goes into detail about all of this stuff, and it's kind of interesting to read. So number one, in fact, it did not mention rudder. It mentioned it somewhere else, but I put that in. You want to make sure you counteract yaw throughout whatever you're doing. Otherwise, you are in danger of spinning. The big thing that they talk about right away is if you have a wing leveler or an autopilot on, turn it off, because you want to make sure you've got the feel and control that you need to recover. Reduce back pressure. So you want to decrease the angle of attack and trim. If you have trim on, you need to undo the trim. Most training aircraft, the trim is not that powerful, so we can typically overcome it. But as you get into bigger aircraft, you may need to use the electric trim, or if it's manual as well, to overcome it, because the forces on larger aircraft are going to be harder, and you probably will not be able to overcome those just by pushing on the yoke or pulling on the yoke, whatever is appropriate. The big thing I would say too is don't shove the yoke forward. And that's where I talked about that minimum loss of altitude. One thing I always teach too is that when we're doing a stall, and that's what I was doing in that video, and I'm going to talk about this when we get into the power off stall especially, is that why is it stalling? Well, yeah, you could get into it's because we're beyond critical angle of attack, but in reality, the practical part is because you're pulling on the yoke. So you don't need to shove forward, you just need to stop pulling. So just relax the back pressure. In most cases, that's typically what's causing the stall. So relax it, you don't need to shove. Just by relaxing it, the airplane's going to want to fly. It doesn't want to stall. It doesn't want to do that. The bank, then you want to make sure you level your wings. So you want to stall first, level the wings, and then pull out as needed. And sometimes we try to do those simultaneously. Thrust and power as needed. So if you're like pointed way nose down, you want the thrust out or the power out, so you don't add to the acceleration. If you're way nose up, you're probably going to want to add power in to help get the speed built back up, and then as you're bringing the nose down. If you have speed brakes or spoilers and they are on, obviously make sure you get rid of those to stop you, to help you build airspeed back up as needed. So just why it says as needed. And finally, return back to your desired flight path. So those are your general steps. Let's talk in specific about each of the types of stalls because people were asking about that. So let's talk about, remember, I wanted to go over the 4 things I wanted to kind of try to talk about as possible in each of these is what's a realistic scenario? How do I recognize and recover? How do I do minimum loss of altitude? And then training out that startle response. So the realistic ones here is that you're setting up for when people get themselves into a power off type stall is because maybe they've lost an engine, right? And they're doing that glide and they're trying to make it to the runway or make it to the field where they are trying to land. So that's where it's likely going to happen. So simulate that, simulate a glide at best glide speed, 65 knots, let's say in a Cessna, or depending on what model you are, right? And then you may have flaps in or out, and then just pick an altitude. I always say, like, pretend like you're coming into land, you're in the flare, or you're just noticing, oh no, I'm too far away, and stretch it, pull the nose up to try to stretch your glide. And that's where I get that stall where you don't even have to pull the nose above the horizon to make it happen. Just by holding altitude, it's gonna stall because it cannot maintain altitude with no power. Or the other big one is this turning base to final is the way you always hear about this as well. And so that turn base to final is the same thing where you get distracted as you're turning, right? And you're kind of rolling the airplane and you're distracted by looking at the runway, and you may lose sight of your airspeed, and it gets slower than you realize. And of course, as you turn, when you bank, that's going to add a little bit more to your stall speed. It's going to make the stall speed a little higher. The more you bank, the higher stall speed goes because some of your lift is now being used to turn the airplane. And so practice those 2 scenarios when doing these power off stalls. So in other words, you want to practice both turning and straight ahead stalls for power off. Here's my tip here. Don't yank the nose up to induce it, because in reality, you're probably not going to do that in real life. You're not going to sit there and say, oh, I'm gliding. Now yank the nose way up and pull the nose way up in the air. That's not realistic. So that's what I would say. I know somebody I saw in the comments said, like, what if my instructor always makes me yank the nose way up? We'll talk about, like, can we make this more realistic? I heard about this. Can we try it? And not to mention the fact that it's in training, it's less scary, but it's also more realistic. I always say that with power on stalls. Like, sometimes in some airplanes, that nose goes up so high. When would you ever do that in real life? I don't see it happening. And then finally, don't shove forward. So when you're recovering, remember what I mentioned before on the recovery is reduce back pressure. If you just relax the back pressure, because you're the one pulling, just relax the back pressure, the airplane's going to recover. That angle of attack is going to reduce. You don't need to shove the nose forward and point the nose way down, because that gets away from our minimum loss of altitude. And that's a startle response because people are afraid. The nose is way up in the air and I'm getting scared. And so my reaction is put the nose back down and shove forward. So we're going to train that out and train ourselves to relax that back pressure and just recover nicely from it. Let me just watch our time here, Donnie. I'll stop after this one and see if there's any quick questions, but I want to make sure that we can hit all the different types, and then we'll have time afterwards for questions for sure. On the power on stall, this is simulating, and this is where actually a lot of stalls do happen in accidents, is on departure, on takeoff, people get distracted. Maybe the nose comes up a little too high, or they're turning. And again, in those turns, they can get distracted. And now we're using some of that lift for the turn itself. And so the stall speed might be a little bit higher. Or on a go around, which I'll talk about. The elevator trim stall is probably even more realistic for that. But on a go around too, they've got all the flaps in, they get distracted, they're pulling the nose up, trying to get away from whatever they're trying to avoid, and this can happen. So simulate those scenarios, make them realistic of what is a real go around like, and then just do it at altitude. The thing that I like to do here is, just like if you're doing the go around or even on takeoff, you're not at cruise speed when you're doing these, right? So slow it down. I like to slow it down to basically rotation speed. So on a 172, 55 knots, I will pull the power, slow it down to 55 knots, and then I'll just be holding altitude and then smoothly add full power, anticipating that right rudder needed to counteract those forces, and then I will pitch it to a pitch attitude that I know will induce the stall. It's usually about 15 to maybe 20 degrees. You don't have to go way up in the air to make this happen. And then work on that coordination. Learn how to watch that nose and not let it move. This will help you be safer in your climbs if you know how to do this, and sort of dividing your attention. And again, on a power on stall, you shouldn't, not only should you not lose altitude, but you probably should end up just climbing, because all you're going to do is it's going to come up. The nose, if you take it the full break, the nose will break, and then just bring it, just relax it back. You don't need to shove forward again. Relax that back pressure and fly out of it. Just get yourself back to that VY pitch attitude where, pulling flaps as needed and so on. And you shouldn't lose any altitude on a power on stall in most training aircraft. Okay, any quick questions on either of these two, Donnie, before I move on?
Not on those two specifically. We did get the Mooney people going, and that was not intentional. That was an example. But somebody's pointed out that Mooney has a great pilot proficiency course,
Yep.
mooneysafety.com. So check that out. Somebody else mentioned another website, so you can Google that or go to YouTube or whatever to see if you can find some videos on Mooney's in particular. But there's lots of comments here about stalling in certain airplanes, and one of the points was is it certified or certificated airplane? Is it certificated?
Certified.
Certified. Okay.
Certified, yeah.
Any certified airplane, you should be able to stall, and you just need to find a good instructor with experience in that airplane, and you should do that for your own safety and those that you fly with. So.
Yep, absolutely. I think it's certified. I don't know, it's a good one. We always say certificated pilot. I don't know. It's you have an airworthiness certificate. Who knows? All right. The next one is, this is probably not something you've probably done, because the other ones we always learn in training are the power on, power off, but a secondary stall. And I've actually done this, and I did it not because I was trying to do it. I did do it in, of course, my CFI training, but I've done these before, like in an aerobatic airplane. I was pointed at the nose. We had done a spin. I was recovering from the spin, and so I was like, man, nose down. I think I've got enough airspeed, and I would pull the nose up and go right into a secondary stall because I didn't have, obviously, enough airspeed to do it. Or enough energy. So a secondary stall is basically when you improperly recover, or maybe you have a startle response to a stall that you've just done. So here it is, you're practicing, let's say, or a stall happens because you got distracted. So you stall, and then as the nose is coming down, and so you get a little worried and you pull back, maybe a little too aggressively, and you go beyond critical angle of attack again, it'll stall again. So these are not ones that are recommended by the FAA for us to go out and just practice on our own. These are actually ones that are demonstration stalls that CFIs will do, and in some cases, during your commercial training, you may do some of these. But go out and try this with a CFI and learn what that's like. So you can actually I would recommend doing a power off stall, practice that, set up just like you normally would be, simulate the power off stall like we talked about previously. And then as you recover, do that push forward, and then kind of you're like, oh no, I'm really low to the ground, and you pull back a little too aggressively and watch it stall again. And that'll give you an idea of how that can happen and what it would feel like. This one too, I'm going to show you a brief section of the essential aerodynamics part of this, but accelerated stalls are when you can stall at a speed above something like VSO. So it's below maneuvering speed. We would do these in demonstration because we don't want to damage the aircraft, but above the normal stall speed, whether it's VSO, VS1, whatever it might be. And in this case, basically what's happening is you've pulled back too aggressively at that high speed. And so it could happen in a bank turn where you've already loaded the airplane up, you're pulling G's like in a 45 or a 60-degree bank turn. And so you've gotten beyond, like it's already at a higher speed. The airplane's had a higher angle of attack during that turn because it's using lift to help you maintain both altitude and that steeply banked turn. So you're already at that higher angle of attack, so you could stall in a steep turn and have this happen. Or if you're doing a dive, like we showed with that video with Dave Hirschman, pulling out of that dive too aggressively can make it happen as well. And this is the part I wanted to show you. This is from our Essential Aerodynamics course. I think it's probably, I'll make it a little bit bigger here. There we go. And I just wanted to show you this little bit of this video right here. They show your normal stall, and airplane's just kind of pitching up. They're showing, and you'll notice the airspeed indicator, and they'll even give you the values here in a minute. So you'll see the nose drop when it stalls, and you can see it's well below the white arc. There's the horn. You can't hear it, but it does show it on the video if you were to watch this in the course. And then they recover, and then they'll show you the parameters here. So it's stalled at about 70 knots or 1G. Now they do one with an accelerated stall, and so in this case, they pitch the nose down, they build up some speed, and then they will aggressively pull back like you're trying to recover from a dive, like, oh no, I got distracted and now I'm trying to pull up. And you'll notice that the airspeed indicator is way above, like at the top of the white arc. And in fact, they'll show us here in a second what those parameters were at 100 knots, and they pulled 3.5 Gs. So it's that idea of Gs being pulled, whether that's in a turn or whether pulling out of a dive. So that's your accelerated stall. And in fact, CFIs will learn these during their training as well. And if you wanted to see what that was like, you could go work with a CFI. And in fact, I've got some recommendations here at the end. I think I've got two more before we sort of get to the point of wrapping up, so I want to watch our time. There is the cross-controlled stall, and these are also done by CFIs. This is another picture I got out of Rod's book, How to Fly an Airplane. It's basically his version of the airplane flying handbook. This is going to happen on that base to final turn. And what's going to happen here is somebody's turning, the wind, especially if there's a crosswind, so they have a tailwind on base, and so they start their turn and they drift beyond final. And so, of course, we've all been taught, typically to try to keep ourselves within safe parameters, no more than 30 degrees of bank in the pattern. So they turn and they notice, man, I'm trying to get back to the runway and I'm at the steep bank angle, so I know that's not right. So I shallow out the bank angle, but I can clearly see that I've gone too far past final. And so they're applying some, let's say in this case, right aileron, but they're using rudder to try to keep the turn going to get themselves aligned with the runway. And so what happens here is that now you've got aileron going this way, the rudder going the opposite way, kind of like you would do in a slip, but in this case, you're setting up in a skid. And what happens then if you get too slow as you're trying to do this, or if you're just, it's like just getting this uncoordinated and getting slow or whatever, then you end up getting this, the aileron, notice the aileron down here, increasing the angle of attack here, that left wing stalls and it's going to drop very rapidly. And now you're low to the ground and you couldn't enter into an incipient spin and not have anywhere near enough altitude to recover from it. So you can read more about this both in the airplane flying handbook from the FAA, which is a link in the handout. You can read about it. They just don't have a picture of it. Or in Rod's book as well, he goes into some good details. But this is that low skidding turn, and it's scary if that were to happen. And then I believe this is the last one before I do the wrap up, which is the elevator trim stall. And this could happen where, and you can simulate this one too. And again, I would do this one with a CFI because CFIs do this during their training. But if you're trimmed up on final, you've got the airplane nice and trimmed, maybe you're at 65 knots, you've already put in full flaps, and now you have to go around. If you don't anticipate and push forward on the yoke and just leave it alone and just put in full power, you're going to see that nose go way up very rapidly, and it can result in a stall. So set up the glide with flaps, apply the power, but don't do anything to overcome the yoke, and you'll see how the nose just goes up very rapidly. And so that's something where it's like we want to know, how does the airplane behave, so that when we're doing a go around, we know what we need to do. I'm going to put this power in and anticipate I need to add forward pressure on the yoke, and then slowly retract flaps as appropriate in your aircraft. Okay, so real quick before we wrap up and answer questions at the end here, how do I avoid stalls? What can we do to avoid them? Number one, stay in the normal envelope, fly by the numbers. In other words, don't go out and do kind of dumb things. Don't go out and try to be a fighter pilot in an airplane that is not certified for that or without the proper training. So if you fly by the numbers, you keep the proper banks that you've been taught, you keep the airspeeds, and you're watching that, that's going to work pretty well. Now, airspeed is not the catch-all because we know we can stall at any speed, but for those that don't have an angle of attack indicator, it's our best thing that we've got. And so if you keep the airplane within that normal envelope of flying, you keep the airspeed where it should be, you just keep flying it the way that you know is safe within the normal envelope, you shouldn't really encounter any stalls. It's never happened to me inadvertently, because I try to pay attention to these things and try to know what it's like. Pay attention to what the energy state of the airplane is. Pay attention, and I'm going to talk about on the next slide as well, what does the airplane feel like, so that I know when it's coming? Is it getting quieter? Do I start to feel that buffet? Do I hear the horn? Anticipate, what's the airplane get like? Are the controls getting mushy like in slow flight? If that were to happen, if you're just getting slow, just be careful. So pay attention to your airspeed. How much altitude do you have? And also, if you have an angle of attack indicator, what's it telling you right here? And this is just showing you, this is out of the airplane flying handbook. It shows you here's situation A, pretty moderate, decent angle of attack here, 10 degrees. It's where I am, and it shows me this little blue circle. And of course, you have to know what your angle of attack indicator, if you have one, what the indications mean. But as I increase angle of attack, it's starting to show me on this one that, oh, I'm a little above, I'm getting to this higher angle of attack. And then the farther I go, it's showing me these indications, showing that I'm higher and higher now, but at this point, right before stall is going to happen. And then, of course, stay coordinated. I talked about some tips on staying coordinated that you can practice. Rod's got some great stuff as well. And there's also, I know when I was doing the research, I couldn't put everything down, but there's lots of YouTube videos out there that talk about coordination exercises that you can do as well to help you practice. Okay, so these are some other angle of attack indicators. All right, my last bit here before we wrap things up and go to the questions, de-terrifying the stall. Number one, work with a CFI. I would highly recommend doing this. So it's like, especially if you're not comfortable, or I really don't recommend you go out and experiment on your own. So work with somebody who's trained in this, just like they were saying for the different manufacturer types. Get someone who knows about this, knows these airplanes really well, and can give you really solid training. do consider doing spin or upset recovery training. Now, for those that are nervous about it, probably not the first thing that I would do. Some of these other things I'm going to tell you, I think work a little bit better to get you sort of introduced, because doing spin training is pretty radical. But if you get to the point where you're comfortable with that, I'd highly recommend that. That's always a good idea, because then you'll know the more of the limits of what the airplane are, and you'll know how to recover if you were to get yourself inadvertently into those situations. And it talks a lot about that in the Airplane Flying Handbook, Chapter 5, which I have a link to on the handout. Floating leaf stalls. Do this with a CFI. I love doing these with students to help them learn the rudder. There's an article that's in the handout about it. I think there's one or two, at least one that talks about the floating leaf stall. And basically it's a power off stall. It's that nose down thing that I was showing you. I get into the stall, and then instead of recovering, I just hold it, and then I practice the rudder. And for me, that helped me build confidence. There was two things that helped me build confidence in getting over my trepidation about stalling, which was, one was my spin training and learning how to do that. And then secondly was doing things like this, because then I learned, like, man, if I just stay on the rudders and just keep the nose from moving, nothing's going to happen, at least at a 172. So you have to know your airplane. But floating leaf stalls, and it's like a training type aircraft, are really useful for that. That really help you get comfortable and know, oh, and then all I have to do is just relax back pressure and the airplane recovers. So very useful for me in learning. Learn to fly using those outside references. So like coordination trick, like I showed earlier, learn to fly outside. That'll really help you, just being able to not get distracted so much. You'll learn to feel the airplane and train those reactions. And the last bit here is that idea of learn to listen to and feel your airplane. It's like, even with that higher airspeed, if you know what the G's feel like, you'll be able to anticipate what's about to happen. You're like kind of know, oh man, I'm pulling G's. I better be paying attention to the condition this airplane is in. Or if I'm getting slow, I'm feeling the buffet, it's getting mushy. So really spend time doing that. And I find that being able to look outside the airplane helps me concentrate on that better, rather than getting that information from the gauges. Whereas we tend to focus on that and just think numbers. Learn to really learn how your airplane feels. And so if you need to, just take a CFI up and cover that stuff up and learn how to fly looking outside. That'll really help. Okay. Real quick before we go to questions, of course, we want to just put in, if you're not an AOPA member, I'm assuming that most of you folks are, and we certainly appreciate you being an AOPA member. But if you're not, we certainly want to recommend that you should be. So go check out aopa.org/membership. We would love to have you part of our AOPA community. And as you can see here, you're going to get all kinds of nice benefits as a member, in staying informed, and most importantly, helping all of us in this aviation community protect your freedom to fly. And our next episode coming up June 20th, 2024. I put the comma in the wrong place. We always screw something up on this, Stephen. Anyway, that was probably my fault, or I'm not sure. But anyway, June 20th, 2024, 12 to 1 Eastern. Get to the Choppa. Fun with learning to fly helicopters. This is our first time we've talked about helicopters. So we've got a special guest coming on, Michael Hangartner, somebody who used to work here at AOPA with us, and he's a CFI, although he's not a helicopter CFI, at least not yet, but he is a helicopter pilot as well. And so he's going to talk to us about just learning to be a helicopter pilot, and just his experience, and some of the cool things that he learned and what's fun about them. So hopefully you'll join us on that episode and learn something cool. All right. If you have any ideas for future topics, please let us know. You can throw it into the chat, and then contact us at ftinitiative@aopa.org. It's right there on the screen. All right, Donnie, hit me up with questions.
Well, I can tell you they want an episode on spins.
Okay, I will work on that, because I've already have an idea for who I would like to ask. So I'm going to see if this person would be willing and available. So I'll work on that after this episode.
Great. Okay. So there was just a comment about learning to recognize the signs that a stall is imminent. And you talked about this, the sound, the mushy controls, those sorts of things. That's, I don't want to say as important as recovery, but you need to learn that, because the stall warning horn is not, it might not be functioning and you don't know it. So you need to understand, you need to practice these, so you get the feel of what it feels like right before the stall.
Yep.
So that was a great point.
And that's where that floating leaf can be really good too, because you'll learn even what it feels like in a stall, the little buffet and all the other stuff. You'll feel that happening, and how to go. And so it's like it's a little bit of a game safely at altitude, but that really it just gets you more comfortable, and I hopefully take some of that fear away. Because I know for me, I don't know about you, but for me, I was always terrified of doing stalls all the way up until I did my CFI training. Is when I finally I think I got over that.
Did you talk about secondary stalls?
I did,
Did you?
and I
Okay,
can
I
do that
missed it.
again. Go back
Somebody
really
had
quick.
asked for information on secondary stalls, and I wasn't sure.
Yep. So secondary
Okay.
stalls, it's in the airplane flying handbook. This is the slide that I used to talk about it somewhat briefly, but airplane flying handbook in the chapter that I linked, it's got lots of good information about it. It's also in Rod's book, but just again, I can do a very fast overview of that. That is when you've stalled, whether you did it inadvertently, it just happened in real life, or you're practicing them, because I've done it in practice where I was doing spin training and then I did a secondary stall on the recovery. So it's like you see right here, you do the initial stall, the nose is coming down, and so now you're trying to recover and you're pulling back, typically probably pulling it back again, and you pull it beyond critical angle and stall it again. That's a secondary stall. And so you can imagine, think in real terms about when this would happen. Think about that startle response. You're low to the ground and you stall it, the nose comes down and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna hit, and you just want to pull up. That's where you could end up stalling again. And this is where I talk about so important to practice minimum loss of altitude and how to do that. What are the control forces that I need to use to recover with minimum loss of altitude and get myself out of it? Because now I think there was a gentleman that we had out in Arizona when I was training, and his whole thing he said stalls are not maneuvers, stalls are ground avoidance maneuvers. Like he called them ground avoidance procedures. So it was like the idea of like, why are we, if at altitude this happens, it's not a big deal, but down low it does. And so it's learning about how do I recognize them, avoid them, and if they do happen, how do I minimize my chances of hitting the ground?
And that's something I always wonder about myself. Like I don't mind stalls. I'm fairly good at recovering from stalls, but I always wonder. But if you're in the pattern, how am I going to react? Am I going to want to pull back? And at that point, you hope the muscle memory and all that training takes over, and that you don't. And then someone else pointed out. We had two people point out why you're actually doing this, and the one is you talked about it, the turn from base to final, and you overshoot the runway and you tighten the turn or whatever, and then you end up in a stall very low to the ground. That's a big reason for practicing these, so that you don't get into a condition like that. And then the accelerated or power on stalls, and this is a great one. I mean, it's you're taking off and you're pulling back harder and harder because you're trying to avoid the trees or the power lines,
Right.
or whatever. And it's just not natural to be headed towards something like that and pushing the nose down, So, I mean, I totally get that, that feeling of wanting to pull back.
Yep. And that's where learning, that's that whole idea of learning. What are the edges there? How do I recover? What does it feel like? And so you can avoid them, because you're exactly right. It's like, we're going to go to those natural instincts. And I can tell you, that was the one thing I definitely learned from becoming a pilot it's like training natural instincts out of you. They're going to hurt you in the long run. So it's a key thing to learn and do it while it's safe.
Yep. Okay. In a power on stall, I've been told to keep adding rudder as the airplane speed decreases to overcome the left turning tendencies at slow speed, high angle of attack. Please comment.
So say that one again, please.
Yep. Keep adding rudder as the airplane speed decreases to overcome the left turning tendencies at low speed, high angle of attack.
Yes, so I guess they're talking about in slow flight. Yes, you're going to have to do that, because remember I said what you don't want to do is to have a spin happen, is get uncoordinated. And so it's like, if you are pulling that nose up, and especially like in a power on stall, you're going to end up adding quite a bit of right rudder to keep it coordinated as you wait for the break to happen. Because if you don't, you're going to have a whole other surprise as the airplane drops a wing and wants to roll over. And so, yeah, you're going to need to anticipate that, and just basically I'm not going to say jam right rudder, but it's all about enough rudder to keep it coordinated. So either keep that nose from moving, keep the ball centered, whatever it takes, so then you can then recover.
Okay. Here's another great one. Can you stall during turbulence, or can turbulence induce a stall?
Sure, because remember, it's all about the relative wind. If I go back way to the beginning, and by the way, there's one thing I did want to mention. I'm going to talk about this as I find it. This guy right here, I didn't really, that's not a great picture. The relative wind is there, but just no arrow. but I'll hit this one first, and then remind me, I want to talk about the person that asked about they spun a 152 in their training, and I wanted to talk briefly about that. So here is the relative wind right here. And so what we have to imagine is that in turbulence, and so that the airflow, like you're getting, the wing is getting bounced around, or the wind direction, like in gusts, is changing, you absolutely can have a stall happen. And so what I want you to imagine here is that rather than the wing and these pictures being moved up, imagine this lower line is the one moving. It's the relative wind direction. And so if the wind gust or the turbulence were to take it and have the relative wind come from a higher angle, you could very much have that wing stall in that case. That's why oftentimes what we'll do is on landings in turbulence, we'll tend to not use maybe full flaps, and we'll tend to fly a little faster. We'll add that gust factor on, which is usually you take whatever the gust is, say it's like 15 gusting 20, and so you take the 5 and then take half of that gust factor and add it on. You're trying to give yourself a little extra airspeed to deal with if a stall potentially were to happen or something like that. So yes, totally, turbulence can cause that. Again, if you're at enough altitude, it's not a big deal. You just recover and just, of course, keep it below maneuvering speed. Let me talk briefly too. There was somebody who wrote in an email as well, and they were describing a situation where they were out doing slow flight. They were a student pilot, I believe, on a solo flight. They ended up doing slow flight. They had full flaps in, and then they decided while they were doing that, hey, I'm just going to go ahead and right into a stall. And typically we would do a power off stall in that situation, but they did a power on stall. And as they did the power on stall, the airplane rolled over and went into a spin. And they were asking why that happened, or was that flaps? I know somebody here, as I mentioned, somebody mentioned asking about a deep stall where you start to lose elevator authority. That will be one that I'll have to research, because I can't speak to that necessarily. But my guess is that the person in the 152 is that more than likely what happened was they got uncoordinated. So they were doing that power on stall and they didn't notice that the ball had moved out, or that the nose was moving, and because the spin won't happen unless you're uncoordinated. It just won't. Because you can even do the floating leaf stall and a power on stall configuration. I've even done that before in 172s, and it'll just sit there and just do this sort of thing as long as you stay on the rudders. And so my guess is that's what happened to you. And then it's like I think the CFIs had told them, like, don't use flaps. It's like I did a little research into that. I didn't see anything because I hadn't heard anything necessarily. You know, we normally don't do power on stalls with full flaps because we're normally not climbing that way, but certainly it's going to add more drag, and maybe there was some disturbance over the elevator. But what I would say to you is, my guess is what happened is you got uncoordinated. In fact, I know that happened because you spun. It wouldn't happen otherwise. So go ahead.
Very good. And this person's asking about ice buildup on the wings. Can an airplane stall from ice buildup on the wings? And if so, are the procedures for recovery the same?
Yes. And in fact, interesting with ice. Ice is its whole own little beast. Number one is what's going on is with the ice, you're deforming the smooth nature of the wing. And in fact, if you want to read something cool, I didn't put this link in the handout because I wasn't planning on talking about it. But if you want to read something cool, go check out the glider flying handbook, and they talk about stalls in there and lift, and they talk about the fact that they try to keep the wings super clean because they're trying to be as efficient as possible. And so this idea of the ice goes into that. You're deforming the wing. The wing is no longer smooth, so you now have a heavier airplane that needs more lift to stay aloft, but you're deforming the very mechanism that creates that lift. And so therefore, what happens is that the airplane's going to stall at a much higher airspeed. If it's just the main wing that we think of, like in a primary aircraft that's got the ice on it, which is probably not the case. It's probably on both surfaces, both the tail and the main wing. But if it's the main wing, yes, you would recover the same way. You want to carry extra power. And biggest thing is you're in an emergency. Declare an emergency and get out of that situation because you are in trouble. And even coming into land, you could be in trouble because it's like the airplane's going to stall at a higher speed. And so you've got to really carry extra speed and just get it down on the ground. I would not use flaps as the typical recommendation, but you would normally recover the same way. However, and there was that Colgan Air accident that happened. You remember that? It was a number of years back with the airliner, and they had a tail stall. So if the ice builds up on the tail, now it's the opposite, because normally what happens is, though, it's going to want to nose down. In this case, you're losing your tail down force if it stalls on the tail, and instead to recover, you literally pull back instead to recover from it. So it's the opposite if you get into ice with a tail stall happening. So the big things I would say here is don't get into icing conditions, because it's like it's only going to happen if you fly into precipitation and it's freezing out. So don't fly into those conditions.
Okay, someone has the question about keeping the ball centered. Well, if the ball is always centered, is it fair to say you will not spin?
That is correct. And I can tell you that because like I said, I've done, and doing it in airplanes that it's, it's like I would not do this in a 182 because that's not an airplane that's certified for spins. I do it in a 172, and I'm in a situation where I know if I were to spin, I'm good. But I will do effectively a floating leaf stall and a power on stall. I've practiced those. And I pull it up into the power on stall and just let it stay stalled and just work the rudder and just don't let the nose move. And if you keep it coordinated, it just stays in the stall. You'll do a little bit of this kind of stuff, but as long as you don't let that ball go out and get uncoordinated, it's not going to stall. It's not going to spin, I should say. It's just going to stay in the stall.
Okay. And then someone's asking, are there circumstances where the stall horn will not sound prior to a stall? And I can think of a couple right off the top.
Obviously, if it was broken somehow or it was maladjusted, I can't speak to just saying is there a situation. Probably in an accelerated stall, it's going to happen very quickly because you're going to be pulling back unless you're gradually pulling back. But if you kind of yank, you might hear the beep, but it's going to stall right after. So it's not really going to give you much warning. You're going to end up stalling. So that's probably what I would think is an accelerated stall. You're probably not going to get a whole lot of warning, even if it were to go off. It's if you're yanking on the yoke, especially like in a dive pull out, you're gonna hear it and it's gonna be stalling at the same time. You're not gonna get much warning. That would be my guess.
Okay. All right. So the angle of attack indicators, I'm not real versed on those, but someone's asking, will those help with the turn to final scenarios, or are those really just good for like straight and level stalls?
They won't help with coordination, but they will keep you at an angle of attack, below critical angle if you know how to read it properly. So it's like you can see here, and you need to know, like, read the manufacturer and what the indications mean. But clearly, green is probably good, low angle of attack. Red is bad, right? So you can see that's a theme here. Obviously, read the manufacturer, read the manual that comes with it if you have one of these installed. But I can tell you, I think it was in the airplane flying handbook I was reading about this, but it does say that is the one thing that is it's unaffected by things like density, altitude, or all this other stuff. Now it's not going to help you with coordination, but it's unaffected by the things that normally would screw us up with airspeed. So yes, they are going to help with things in turns as well.
Okay. Lots of comments here that I think we can save for the episode on spins, unless you want me to read them off. I think there's a lot of good questions and comments about spins here. Somebody else pointed out, yes, learning and practicing slow flight to get a feel for the mushy controls, that'll help prevent you from getting into a stall because you'll recognize it. So we've talked about that. Let's see. Can you recover from a spin in an airplane that's not certified for spins?
Maybe.
Exactly. Yep.
I mean, the reason that it's you'd have to go back and I guess look at the flight testing, because the test pilots are the ones that determine whether or not it meets the requirements for being spin certified. I suppose it's possible. It's probably difficult, and I'm sure that there are. And again, you're talking. I've read, I think, this stuff a long time ago, and I just don't remember the details anymore. But I seem to recall that there are certain requirements that it needs to be able to recover by so many turns with so much input. So I suppose it might be possible, but if it's not certified for it, that means that a professional pilot, there's not just a professional, but a professional test pilot determine, with their testing and everything else, that this is not okay for spinning, and they were having a hard time with it. You and me, we're probably in big trouble. So
Yep.
don't do it.
Okay. And you've talked about this, but can floating leaf stalls be done with the standard Cessna 172?
Yes, absolutely do it in 172. And I noticed somebody here said, I think it was Jerry, and somebody else said it's falling leaf, not floating leaf. I call them floating leaf. Falling leaf is what you see in the article, so I don't know that that's that important. But yes, I've done those in the 172 a whole bunch, and it's again, because if you're concerned, like I said, go up with the CFI, because it's like I do these, but it's like I'm not doing it with passengers on board and loaded with cargo or anything. I'm doing it in a typical training scenario, 2 people in the front, or maybe just by myself, and no weight in the back. So I'm making sure that the CG is forward in that nice safe zone and utility category, just in case.
Yep.
There you go.
Okay.
William Taft told us there, has to recover before the third turn. So that's what it is when it comes to that spin certification. I'm sure that sounds like something I read before,
Okay.
something similar.
Right. Do you have? Go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I see Ron mentions here, do you not recommend slips for landing since they are cross-controlled? And it's interesting, and I can't answer definitively right now. I need to go back and reread and get it straight in my own head. But slips are okay, skids are not okay. And like I said, I know that I've read, yeah, by the way, we are past the hour mark. So anybody that's here for Wings credit, you're good to go. Don't worry about it if you need to pop off. But I know Rod talks about it in his book, and I need to go back and reread it in more detail to get that skid. So maybe we can include that in. We'll get into a detail about that when we talk about the spin. We'll do like an episode on spins. But yeah, slips are okay. If you do a slip to landing, you're good to go. But again, I always watch my airspeed. You obviously don't want to stall while you're doing it, but it's the skid and it's getting slow and stalling where it's the problem. So you want to avoid the skids. The difference between the two, I need to go back and review again to get it straight. So I can't answer that off the top of my head right here.
Okay. Recommendations for practicing stalls on a simulator. I know you don't have the feelings that you have in the actual airplane, but is that something that's a good idea?
Absolutely. It's just if people are just chiming in there, but absolutely for the sim, I like to use the sim for practicing at least the procedure. Like I said, when I was messing around with the one that I used to make the video, it was good for the power off stall. It worked well for that. Power on stall, it did not behave so well. The ball kept wanting to go out. It was kind of going out like it wasn't responding the way that I know that it works in the real airplane. So a lot of times simulators, and it may have just been the 172 model that I was using in it, they're made to work well within the normal realms of flight. But when you push it to the edges, they don't always behave well. You might want to try maybe like a Microsoft flight sim using the extra might behave better because it's supposed to be an aerobatic aircraft. But yeah, absolutely, I think that they're useful. I've done it in the sims that we've got here at AOPA as well, and I've trained people on just sort of the procedure. And that's the one where I told you I trained this person on stalls in the sim before we went and did them in the airplane, kind of used it as like an advanced chair flying. So when we actually did it in the airplane, he had already practiced the procedures and it was like, oh, that's it. I'm like, yes, that's it. There's no big deal. They're not all scary. You already know what's going to happen. And it was pretty similar. You just have all the kinesthetic things that go with it too. But
Yep. I remember when I was trying to get back into flying and you were helping me with that, with pattern work. I wanted to do pattern work in the simulator, and you were saying it's not a great idea. You can't always see the runway in the simulator, and really that needs to be done in the pattern. But I did find, and you weren't saying not to do it. You just said it's not as good as the actual thing in the airplane.
It's got limits.
Right. But I remember I was doing them in the simulator anyway for those same reasons, just to get the procedures down, and it did help. The next time I got into the airplane, the pattern was much better.
And in fact, what I would say is that it depends on the sim that you're using too, because we've got the one sim here that's got panels go all the way around, and you can see 90 degrees off or a little bit past. That's great for that. Works really well. If the key is for the pattern type work or the sim, like in that case, you need to be able to see the runway. And what I find is that actually, like on my home computer, it's the little laptop that I'm using. Actually, it was my AOPA work computer. You can do it on that if you've got the sim where you have the control and you can change your view and like tap over to look left or look right, because then you can just get used to like, oh, there's the runway, and then I can go back to right to the front. That works really well. It just happened to be the one sim that we've got here that doesn't do that. It doesn't give you that full wraparound. It's not useful because you can't tell where the runway is. But if you have one where you can change your view, it works really well for that.
Yep. Okay.
By the way, somebody here, Sean, mentions FAA just issued guidance on slips. I need to go look this one up. So Sean, if you can throw me a reference on that, that would be awesome. During landing not being stabilized approach, you might want to comment, that we still do them despite the guidance. So I need to look at that guidance. I'm really curious to see that one. I've not seen that one, and I would love to read it. Okay, all right. Yeah, it just, somebody says, in a slip, you cross control aileron and rudder. In the skid, you skid the controls, aileron and rudder on the same direction, just excessive incorrect amounts. And again, that's why I said I want to go look at the aerodynamics of that and why they make a distinction between them.
Okay. This comment says, getting into a secondary stall on a check ride used to be an automatic fail. Is it still? Any idea?
My guess would be, because I have to go and like really read carefully the ACS. I don't recall that in there if it says that that's an automatic fail. Here would be my guess. if everything's going really well and you're doing well and you do a stall and you accidentally do a secondary stall, my guess would be that most EPs would have you repeat it. And if you don't do it the second time, probably okay, assuming that everything else has gone well. If you've got things that are adding up, that you're screwing things up and maybe you're not prepared and you're messing other things up, and then you do that, that could be where it's a fail. So I have not seen that. I may be wrong, and somebody might be able to throw out a quote for me on that one. But yeah, that would be my suspicion. Just like I used to be a check airman, and I had a person one time was a pre-solo stage check, and we were doing slow flight, and they did slow flight like slower than I have ever seen it before. And I asked them to do a turn, knowing what was going to happen. They went right over into a spin, and I knew it was going to happen. And I even told them, "You don't have to fly it this slow." And like, "Nope, this is the way I was taught." I'm like, "Okay." So it's like that sort of thing. That was obviously an automatic fail, because it's like they had no idea how close they were to a spin or what to do, and so that sort of thing. So it just depends. Like, you have to judge it on what else you're seeing.
Okay. We talked about with the poll. We asked people, how often do you practice? So somebody's asking, how often do you recommend practicing stalls?
You just want to get to the point where you're comfortable, and it's like anything, it's the physical parts. I mean, you and I both know, Donnie, we were both rusty at some point, and I don't know about you, but the flying part came back pretty quickly. But still, it's that idea of, do I know what it feels like? So, do you need to do it? How often are you flying, right? If you're flying once a week, do you need to do it every flight? Probably not. I don't know that I've got it, but you just want to make sure that you're comfortable. For me, one of my things I like to practice is the power off, that turn back to the runway. I like to practice that procedure in case I were to ever need it. And I want to be sharp on that and know what the airplane feels like. So yeah, do you need to do it every flight? Depends. If you're only flying every couple of months, then maybe you should be, or going up with a CFI and keeping yourself proficient that way. So just, I guess, use good judgment on that one.
Okay. Here's another good one. What are your thoughts about stalls in instrument conditions? It talks about it being that much more difficult to recognize.
Right. Well, that's the whole thing that I don't, in fact, I don't think it's in the ACS, or is that still a PTS? I have to go back and look. But for the instrument training, but a good CFI, or good CF double I in this case, is going to have you practice stalls on the instruments and how to recover from them. So yeah, it's definitely going to be harder, especially if you get into a spin or something recovering from it, because you only have the instruments to look at, and that's assuming that your attitude indicator doesn't tumble. So when it comes to stalls, you want to learn those when you're doing your BAI, your basic attitude instrument training, or doing your proficiency. Practice stalls under the hood, or practice them so that you will know what to do if it were to happen. The big thing I would say is that I have been, knock on wood, I don't have any wood in here, I've got some Formica or whatever this stuff is, but I would say is that, fly within parameters. Keep yourself within that safe envelope. Stay risk averse. Fly by the numbers. Because I have not had an inadvertent stall happen in doing that, other than when I was doing things like spin training and trying to recover and that sort of stuff and doing something wrong. But any kind of normal flying, I've never had a stall sneak up on me, because I try to be really aware of where's my speed, what's my angle of attack. I know somebody mentioned too, your stick. Where's the stick position located? These kinds of things. So really pay attention, and you should be able to avoid it.
Okay. Someone's asking if you can show the second angle of attack slide.
Second angle of attack slide. Let's see what they mean. Is it this one they mean, or I don't know?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure.
Do they mean the angle of attack indicator? Because
yeah, that's probably it. Did you have one of those?
I had this.
Okay.
Maybe that's what they were thinking of.
Okay.
This is out of the airplane flying handbook, by the way.
Very good. How about best altitudes to practice stalls?
High. I like to go high. I think the FAA guidance is you need to be able to recover above 1500 AGL, which is, to me, is a pretty good safe parameter. I even like 2000. I want more rather than less. So yeah, it's like I will at least double that or go higher. So it's like around here, we're typically around 300-400 feet MSL. So I'll go up to at least 3,000 feet on practicing these kind of things. So I'm doing something like the falling or falling leaf stalls, or floating with, whatever you want to call them. Those kind of things, I tend to give myself a little extra altitude just in case, I were to inadvertently go into a spin or something, get uncoordinated.
Okay. Someone mentioned we were talking about doing a power on stall with full flaps, and someone just mentioned that's a scenario of a botched go around where the
Yep.
pilot
Oh
forgets
yeah.
to reduce the flaps, and I've been there, and of course as soon as I recognized it, I dumped the flaps. It's like so I
Not a
had
great idea either.
two big mistakes in a row.
That's why it's that's that idea of training is like typically we might do it with 10 degrees of flaps on takeoff, but yeah, you can practice the go around part, right? And then that idea of course, then I'm not typically going to be practicing a stall. It's practice your go around. It's that I'm coming in, I'm going to level off, right? So just get level off at an altitude and bring up one notch of flaps. As soon as I notice I'm not descending at all, then bring up the second notch and wait for that 10 until I'm close to VY. By the way, a little trick in the 172 that a lot of times it's hard. You know what the pitch attitude, if you've been practicing, what it looks like outside for VY, which is what you want, or VX dependent. But what I found is that the 172, especially like the S and R models, if you're it'll go right to about 70 knots with 10 degrees of flaps in at that attitude. And if you just bring those 10 degrees of flaps up at that point, it goes boom, right to 74, which is VY. So I always like bringing that last notch up right when I know I'm just before VY, and it'll just kind of take me right to it rather than faster.
Okay. Any significant differences installing a twin?
So man, it's been a while since I've flown a twin. So installing, I'm trying to remember what we used to do. I don't know that. I'm trying to remember if we used to even take those to full break at all, because obviously like single engine, you would never do that because of VMC, which is rolling the airplane over. Did we go to full break? I feel like we just went to first indication. But I would check the manufacturer's recommendations on that, and especially because especially a power on stall with both those engines, that's where that pitch attitude gets crazy high because you have all that thrust. So those would be the things I would think about is what does the manufacturer say about it? Are you doing something that's safe, right? Because it's like if you're getting that pitch attitude crazy high because of all that thrust, probably a full power on stall is not a good idea. This stuff's coming back as I'm thinking about it. And so I remember we tended not to do those kinds of things. I think we went to first indication. I do not remember going to full break on those, but I may be mistaken. So yeah, the things you're worried about are excess of, especially power on, excess of pitch up. Power off, not a big deal. It's going to act like any other airplane on a power off stall, just like sort of that straight thing. But the power on is where I would be concerned with that. I think maybe we did them at partial power or something when we did them. So I'd have to go back and look. So please don't hold me to that. It's been a while since I've flown twins.
All right, and someone's asking, do you have any experience in an airplane with a very clean wing like a Viking and power on stalls? I know that's very specific.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the Viking. And then this is probably not the same, but yeah, only to buff it plus accelerated airflow. Yep, so it sounds right, Tom. I'm thinking of like the RV has got a really clean wing, and those stall no problem. Just keep them coordinated. It would depend on know your airplane and talk to the other folks that are experts in that model, especially if it's a more high performance type, to see what the deal is with those and what the idiosyncrasies might be. Because I know like specific like Bonanzas and Moonies and things like that, they have their owners groups and they'll tell you all about it. Cessnas, especially 172s and stuff like that, are very docile.
Okay, I'm looking through to see if there was anything that we missed. I don't know if you see anything you want to talk about.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything new on there, so I think we might be okay. So guys, let me just, or I shouldn't say guys, folks out there, let's just remind you again, don't forget, June 20, we're going to talk about flying helicopters. I will reach out. There's somebody I'm thinking of, and we'll see if we can get somebody to talk to us about in more detail and with more authority than I can probably bring to bear right now on spins, and we'll work on that. But learning to fly and learning fun with learning to fly helicopters, get to the Choppa. It will be our episode coming up. So hope you'll join us for that one coming up in June. So anyway, everybody, thanks so much. Thanks, Donnie, for being here with us. Thanks, Chris, Stephen, behind the scenes. Very much appreciate you guys helping us out, and appreciate all of you guys because we wouldn't have the show without the audience. So very much appreciate you guys all being here.
Yep. Thank you, Chris.
All right. We'll see you next time.
All right.